And thank you for joining us for the panel today called Human Rights in Iran, A Way Forward. My name is Shabnam Mujtahedi, and I will be moderating the panel. We have a fascinating lineup of speakers joining us, but I would like to thank human rights activists in Iran for bringing us together for this event. HRA monitors human rights violations in Iran and disseminates news about abuses to keep the Iranian and international communities informed and to ensure that victims are not forgotten. If you're joining us today, I assume you have some knowledge about the situation in Iran. Iran's human rights record has gone from bad to worse in the past decade. There's been the regime's brutal crackdowns on protests. There's a long list. We could have just one session dedicated to that. But most recently was the crackdown on protests over water shortages in Khuzestan province, where security forces used live ammunition against peaceful demonstrators. Meanwhile, the Iranian people are facing a severe economic crisis due to the combined impact of US sanctions and disastrous national policies. In August, the quote-unquote moderate reformist Rouhani government was replaced by the conservative principalist Ebrahim Raisi, and many Iranians fear a further deterioration to fundamental freedoms. It's still unclear whether Iran and the US will be able to overcome the rise in tensions over the past 4 years to negotiate a return to the Iran deal. But Iranian human rights advocates are watching closely. They have reasons to be concerned. One of the criticisms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA for short, was that the Obama administration did not incorporate demands for improvements to Iran's human rights record into the negotiations. Since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 and applied what his administration called a maximum pressure campaign, Iranian human rights activists insisted that human rights should play a more prominent role in diplomatic efforts. It is in this context that we are gathered to discuss rights-based approaches to diplomacy with Iran. We have an incredible panel of speakers, but before introducing them, we will hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, Javaid Rehman. Dr. Rehman is a professor of international human rights law and Muslim constitutionalism at Brunel University, London. Mr. Rehman teaches and publishes on the subjects of human rights law and Islamic law. Several of his published works have been translated into various languages. As a human rights lawyer, Dr. Rehman has also provided legal opinions in various high-profile cases in several jurisdictions. So I'll turn it over to a video of his.
Dear colleagues, dear participants, I thank you for inviting me today to deliver the opening of this panel on a topic that is of importance not just in relation to Iran, but which is core for the promotion of human rights worldwide. Diplomacy plays a role in the advancement of human rights at different levels, at the level of creation and development of the legal framework for human rights, and at the level of ensuring compliance with that legal framework. The human rights law and standards that we have today are the fruits of diplomacy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent conventions, resolutions, and declarations are the result of negotiations and compromises in which not only state representatives have been involved, but also civil society, individuals, and academia. Diplomacy and consensus building is thus inherent in the advancement of human rights. But human rights diplomacy does not and should not stop at the creation of human rights law. While each state, as part of its sovereignty, has duty and responsibility to protect and promote human rights within their jurisdiction, we all know very well that this responsibility is not always exercised the way it should be. The protection and promotion of human rights is an ongoing endeavor for all states, and where all states need to seek continuous improvement. However, some states fall seriously short of a genuine commitment to advancing human rights within their jurisdiction, not only by failing to ensure policies that can promote human rights, but by adopting policies that systematically violate human rights. I should stress that this is not exclusive to certain regions or certain cultures, but a result of political choices, sometimes choices where the population does not have a say. In the case of Iran, the key domestic factors that could enable the advancement of human rights are to a large extent blocked. We can see around the world that in countries where there is a dynamic and free civil society, there is also a better protection of human rights. In Iran, civic space is under significant constraints, and civic space actors such as human rights lawyers, defenders, and journalists are targeted, harassed, and excluded. Moreover, the channels for political participation, including channels for consultations, are by law severely restricted and manipulated to the extent that they prevent meaningful participation in decision making. And the absence of a meaningful framework for accountability leaves perpetrators in power, including at the highest levels of public office. It is especially in this context that diplomacy and international community can and should play important roles. While some states pursue a human rights dialogue in their bilateral engagement with Iran, there remains much to be done as part of the international legal framework. In fact, as part of the rule of law at international level, it is imperative that human rights systematically be part of every bilateral and multilateral engagement, not just with Iran, but with all countries. However, we have seen that human rights foreign policy can sometimes be politicized or used for the pursuit of other goals. Nevertheless, these malpractices should not become an excuse for excluding human rights from diplomacy. On the contrary, more should be done to ensure a genuine, principled, and consistent integration of human rights compliance into bilateral and multilateral engagements, including on trade, economy, and other forms of agreements. This is not the case today. In the context of Iran, international human rights standards and compliance with these human rights standards must form the essential pillar of all future engagements and agreements. In addition to bilateral and multilateral engagements, it is within the mandate and responsibility of member states in multilateral fora, such as the United Nations and its Human Rights Council, to address thematic or country-specific situations of concern through the means that are available. As a special rapporteur appointed by the Human Rights Council, I am mandated to monitor, report, and issue recommendations on the situation of human rights in Iran. This mandate is in itself a result of diplomacy, and my work and that of my colleagues can be at the service of human rights-based diplomacy. The challenge of human rights diplomacy today is that international human rights law and mechanisms that are tasked with promoting state compliance with it are increasingly challenged. While one cannot deny the politicization of issues in these fora, they remain an important arena to address human rights, and there is need to strengthen these aspects rather than disregard them as merely political. What is required are creative solutions based on human rights law, which can lead to meaningful change and ultimately to ensure that these domestic conditions and actors for advancing human rights in a country are strengthened and that human rights improvements can grow from within. I look forward to hearing the panel's discussions about various forms of approaches to this issue. I thank you.
So, Dr. Rehman did an excellent job of framing this issue, but now I'd like to turn over to the panelists to provide more specifics on the relationship between diplomacy, U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, and the Iranian human rights situation. So I will ask each speaker to keep their remarks to around 5 minutes. And then we will turn it over to the audience for questions. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we will get to them after the panelists have finished with their remarks. Okay, great. So Michael Page is the Deputy Director in the Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. He has worked extensively with civil society organizations in the Middle East, including on the documentation of human rights abuses during the Syrian conflict. At HRW, he supervises work on several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, and Egypt. Michael, Human Rights Watch calls for a rights-based approach to U.S. diplomacy. Could you describe what you think that approach should look like in the context of U.S. engagement with Iran, and how should the United States prioritize human rights during any future discussions with Iran?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for inviting me today. And I just want to start off by thanking HRA for their critical work in documenting Iranian authorities' egregious human rights violations. It's an incredibly difficult task to document the abuses of an autocratic government when there's almost no access for outside rights groups, but it's a critical mission. And so that's, I guess, where I want to start off with the fact that it's a very difficult human rights reality in Iran that really limits what the US can constructively do, right? These are Iranian authorities who shot down Flight 752 in January 2020, killing 176 people. And the government's main response was to attempt to cover it up and failed, and then harass victims' families for demanding accountability. These are authorities that have overseen a wide-reaching crackdown on civil society. And maybe most importantly, authorities whose president, Ebrahim Raisi, won, but in unfree and unfair elections for president this past June, and who not only headed the country's abusive judiciary previously, but is credibly accused in involvement in probably the most heinous crime in Iran's modern history, which is the 1988 mass executions of prisoners. So that's a grim reality that the US is facing in Iran, but that doesn't mean it's hopeless. Rather, I guess I want to suggest maybe 3 areas where, even given this situation and the uncertainty of the nuclear deal, the US has the ability to positively influence human rights for people in Iran. I would say number 1 is adopting a do no harm approach, right? The US has the most control over its own policies towards Iran, in particular, broad sanctions. Broad US sanctions on Iran have contributed to serious hardships for ordinary Iranians, including threatening their right to health, but also access to other services that we can discuss more. So working with businesses and civil society, I think the Biden administration should, as a starting point, seek to mitigate the negative impact of broad sanctions, including this issue of overcompliance, in which companies refuse to sell goods or services to people in Iran because of the risk of sanctions, even though those goods or services have humanitarian exemptions. So in the past, specialized medicines for Iranians. Number 2, the US can build multilateral pressure on human rights issues. So in coordination with Iranian civil society groups and other states, try to prioritize focus on a few key human rights issues, ideally where local civil society has also sought to mobilize domestic change. And I want to admit, this is a frustratingly slow process, but the combination of domestic and international pressure over a long period of time was important to changing the country's draconian death penalty for drug offenses. So after years of domestic and international pressure on Iran's government, authorities passed a law in November 2017 that significantly restricted, but it didn't eliminate, the death penalty for drug offenses in Iran. Number three is human rights sanctions and international accountability efforts. So, given what I mentioned above about the serial abuses of Iran's government, avenues to hold Iranian officials accountable outside of the country are critical, even if they are relatively limited. So, for instance, U.S. global Magnitsky Act sanctions can be useful ways to target officials who have carried out serious abuses or are involved in corruption, but those sanctions are they're made up of travel bans and asset freezes. So that is often a limited means to pressure Iran's most senior officials. On the other end of the spectrum is universal jurisdiction, in which the ability of a state judicial system to investigate and prosecute certain crimes, even if they weren't committed in that state's territory. That is another tool for activists and for states who are using that to seek accountability for the most serious crimes, including crimes against humanity. And I wanted to reference that currently there is an ongoing trial in Sweden for an alleged Iranian perpetrator involved in the 1988 mass executions. So while it's unlikely that senior Iranian officials who have been involved in these most serious crimes will travel to countries with universal jurisdiction, it's still something the US and other countries can do to both adopt and encourage other countries to adopt these the universal jurisdiction laws into their domestic laws. Lastly, the US can also support UN accountability mechanisms, which other panelists are likely going to talk about in more detail, but that's another avenue to pressure Iranian authorities on human rights. And then my final point is that all US actions as it relates to Iran are more effective when the US adopts a more consistent human rights policy. So the US will be less effective in promoting human rights in Iran when they ignore or they're even complicit in abuses carried out by US allies in the Middle East region or elsewhere, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I think you touched on all of the points that each of the other panelists will go more in depth on, including, the support for documentation efforts, the opportunities and constraints for accountability, regional approaches and diplomacy as being a component of a Iran-specific approach, and then, of course, sanctions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick Clawson, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Washington Institute, where he directs the Vitrebi Program on Iran and U.S. policy. He has authored more than 150 articles about the Middle East and international economics, and is the author or editor of 18 books and studies on Iran. Patrick, decades of sanctions and the recent maximum pressure campaign have failed to improve the human rights situation in Iran, with many arguing that it has had a detrimental impact for ordinary Iranians. What are the current deficiencies of the sanction regime, and what steps should the Biden administration take to decrease the negative impacts of sanctions on human rights? And any other comments you have on U.S. diplomacy with Iran?
The Biden administration is disappointed with what it sees as a slow Iranian response in the nuclear negotiations. And therefore, the Biden administration is considering additional pressure on Tehran, that is, additional measures to enforce existing sanctions and potentially additional sanctions, with the aim of showing Tehran that the longer the Iranian government waits, the more difficult will be the situation for Iran. That's the overall context in which we should discuss what can be done about the human rights situation in Iran and U.S. government policy. Now, the Biden administration has been debating what it can do to support human rights and address humanitarian concerns. Much of the discussion about human rights has been about updating and expanding measures to facilitate Iranian access to information and communications, such as social media. And this is mostly meant a discussion about revising and updating what's called General License D1, which was issued by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, in 2014. And that license was meant by the Obama administration to allow Iranians access to social media and to anti-censorship programs. But it has gotten badly out of date. So it was issued 7 years ago, before there was much cloud services and hosting. And the main technology companies have restricted access to Iranian residents and nationals for key programs. So Apple in 2018 blocked access to the Apple Store after earlier blocking access to Apple ID. Amazon blocked access to Amazon Web Services in 2019. And Android developer tools are no longer available to Iranians, and they can't create GoDaddy accounts. So this is an area where the human rights community could have an impact. I would urge interested people to press the Biden administration to make such changes a priority. As I say, there is a discussion going on in the administration about moving, but bureaucracies can be quite slow. What is really needed is consultation between the US government and the main technology companies to ensure that whatever rules are adopted actually work. That is to say that they provide access to Iranians for social media and for censorship evasion programs. By contrast to the good prospects for changes regarding access to technology, the outlook is poor for changes about humanitarian goods. The US-sponsored mechanisms with Swiss and South Korean governments that were designed to facilitate access to humanitarian goods, and the European Union created its own mechanism called INSTEX for the same purpose. None of these have worked. And a major issue has been that the Iranian authorities seem to have decided that they have adequate access to humanitarian goods and through the channels they're now using, which are best be described as evading sanctions, and they find it easier to use barter and other means to avoid the sanctions restrictions, rather than going through the quite onerous requirements for these various mechanisms. And I don't think that's going to change. A more complicated issue is the question of imprisoned dual nationals. The United States government devotes a lot of attention to this issue. Not much attention, frankly, to Iranians who are imprisoned, but a lot of attention to dual nationals. But the US government is very reluctant to engage in the prisoner swaps, for which Iran is pressed. Part of the objections are ideological. Don't swap guilty people for those who are innocent of doing anything. But the main objection has been practical, namely that if Iran gets something for a swap like this, that it will be in the interest of the Iranian government to imprison more people, and that they will therefore indeed imprison more dual nationals in order to provide bargaining chips. It's not clear to me what will happen in this issue, but as I say, the US government will remain very involved on it.
Thank you, Patrick, for that insight. And I think your last point on prisoners, both dual nationals and of course high-profile human rights activists who have been imprisoned arbitrarily in Iran are of great concern and part of the human rights diplomatic discussions that have taken place. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christina. Christina Storm started her career as a trial lawyer where she founded Lawyers Without Borders after another 20 years harnessing lawyers around the world to advance human rights in local and international courts, she joined a DT Institute as the director of the Rule of Law Division. Christina has a long history of working with Iranian lawyers and human rights practitioners, and she currently consults with HRA. Christina, you've worked to leverage innovative approaches to international law to promote meaningful accountability during your career. In your opinion, what are opportunities to close the existing accountability gap in Iran, and what are the technical challenges to holding Iranian human rights abusers accountable in the international context?
Thank you for inviting me to join this esteemed group. It's an honor to be in this company. My work in this region has historically, for the last 10 years or so, been devoted to working at a very granular level with advocates and lawyers like myself who practice criminal law and face day-to-day challenges representing individuals who are accused of serious crimes with more serious consequences, all grounded in what we would view as very acceptable human rights freedoms and behaviors in response to their exercising their internationally protected rights. So my work has been focused on how to leverage internationally protected rights, and in particular Iran's international obligations and commitments in a local domestic context, as well as supporting the documentation so we can raise the caliber of evidence collection in order to strengthen eventual human rights cases. And in that regard, I'm referencing the universal jurisdiction litigation. In that regard, understanding what I call universal rights, how to raise their profile in domestic courts and at a higher level in international fora and among civil society and in communities at large, is the challenge we are all working on today. Finally, my work of late with HRA has been focused on understanding different levels of culpabilities of actors who are complicit at different levels in meting out punishments and atrocities, in an attempt to ensure that it is well understood in the international scene that there is almost always some criminal culpability at some level, and socializing that to arm those who are in a position to employ one of the various mechanisms, whether it's a UN mechanism or a UJ mechanism, to seek more and a better accountability for that conduct. This is very, very much, in contrast to some of my colleagues on this panel, a bottom-up approach, which plays to the strength of trial lawyers around the world, attempting to take their skills and tools and be more strategic with their implementation to address the abridgment of human rights. So the ultimate, the goals, the impacts we would hope to achieve would be to improve evidence collection, making for better litigation, better strategic litigation, generate inspiration for civilians at the domestic level, give access to the general public at the domestic level of the information, pressure the UN to become more efficient, more effective, pressure diplomats to include human rights in their diplomacy, energize third parties to bring actions around the world, and as an unintended beneficial consequence, restrict the freedoms of the very people who are oppressing others by making it difficult for them to travel about the world and go about their business.
Thank you so much. And I know that there aren't a lot of opportunities for international accountability in Iran. And of course, within Iran itself, very few opportunities for justice for victims and their families. But I think the work of documentation, of course, is extremely valuable in that effort. And that's where I think the work of HRA becomes really important because documentation is the backbone of international accountability efforts and future transitional justice processes. So Skylar Thompson is the Senior Advocacy Coordinator at Human Rights Activists in Iran, HRA, where she works towards justice and accountability through monitoring, documenting, and spotlighting Iranian human rights abusers. Previously, she was an advocate for prisoners' rights and access to health during the Rohingya refugee crisis. This year, HRA launched a project entirely focused on accountability for Iranian rights abusers. Skylar, how can governments and international intergovernmental organizations use tools and resources developed by HRA to promote justice and accountability in Iran? And what changes would you like to see to the U.S. policy towards Iran?
Thanks, Shabnam. It's really an honor to be here today, speaking alongside all of you. To begin, I think it's really important to highlight that there are several tools already available for governments to hold these rights violators accountable. I think it's important to highlight that it's the use of these tools that seems to be lacking. We see time and time again that accountability is a real deterrent for future violations. So part of the motivation behind creating the project that you mentioned, Spreading Justice, is the belief that if the international community can prioritize closing the accountability gap, we will see a disruption in the continuous cycle of abuse. Spreading Justice provides information that can be used by governments that are willing and able to use the accountability tools that are already in their arsenals. And I'll speak a bit more about Spreading Justice in a bit, but to answer your question regarding the changes that we'd like to see, I'll start with saying something that Michael has mentioned previously, and it's about the use of targeted sanctions. Targeting individuals has been proven to be more effective than targeting institutions. And to illustrate that, I'll give an example of our experience with the consequences at HRA. So when the United States designated the Tehran Prison Organization in 2017, it cited deep concern regarding the human rights situation in the country. However, this designation posed serious challenges for civil society documentation efforts. The inability to monitor the situation of prisoners' rights inside of Iran's notoriously torturous prisons had a direct and negative impact on the situation of human rights. Prior to the US designation, HRA maintained contact with an internal division tasked with reviewing violations of staff inside of the prisons. We were able to send copies of published reports citing these staff violations, and we experienced some positive outcomes in this regard. But because of the sanctions that have been imposed, if HRA were to continue sending the reports to internal monitoring divisions inside of Iran, we would be subject to prosecution inside of the United States. And this is a bit of the consequences that I think Michael was referring to when he was speaking about companies engaging and sending things inside of the country. The inability to maintain our contact with this division is a direct result of sanctions meant to target human rights violations. But in reality, the sanctioning has harmed civil society's efforts to monitor and highlight violations in a place that is notorious for harsh interrogations, for forced confessions, for psychological and physical torture, and denial of access to medical care. Conversely, we see that when individual prison officials are sanctioned, targeted individuals, there has been a deterrence of abuse, and not only on part of the violator, but his associated colleagues as well. I will say that globally, there has been a positive shift from these broad sanctions, like those imposed on the prisons organization, to targeted sanctions like the ones we're speaking about today. These targeted sanctions, they typically involve asset freezing or visa bans, and they're particularly important in the case that accountability in domestic judicial frameworks is unlikely. And I think we can all agree that in the case of Iran, that is the case, at least currently where we stand today. The European Union, shortly after announcing a new global human rights sanction regime in December 2020, utilized these tools to designate 8 Iranians for rights violations. And these were the first designations of their kind since 2013 inside of the EU. And there's certainly room for improvement. The United Kingdom, for example, 1 year into their own newly established sanctions regime that's targeted on human rights, had designated 72 individuals in 6 entities, but the list included no Iranians. And this while British Iranian dual nationals were detained in Iranian prisons. I'll give the example of Nazanin Radcliffe. She was initially sentenced to 5 years in prison, citing espionage by Judge Salavati. Salavati is an individual whose violations are widely documented. He's in fact become known as the death judge. In a legal review of Salavati's violations for the Spreading Justice Project, Brian Curran described his actions as appearing to pass the death sentence arbitrarily, almost at a whim determined by how he felt on that day. He continued in his review to say that it was difficult to distinguish between a judicial death sentence and an unlawful killing. And while Salavati holds a place on the US and EU sanctions list for serious rights abuses, the UK has yet to take similar action. But in addition to the proven impact of targeted sanctions regimes, these types of designations can present a comparatively small amount of collateral damage. Broad sanctions like those imposed on Iranian financial institutions, even with the humanitarian exemptions granted, have had wide-reaching consequences on the Iranian people, and as Michael mentioned, notably in their fight against COVID-19 and other serious health conditions. But circling back to the discussion of HRA's new project, and in working towards targeted designations, governments and all governments and intergovernmental organizations should be encouraged to work along civil society and utilize the resources they can provide. The individuals behind our own project, they closely monitor and document and profile these violators in an incredibly comprehensive and informed way. It's noteworthy that civil society has unparalleled access to and established trust with witnesses and victims inside of the country. And I really believe strongly that this access should be utilized by governments working on holding perpetrators accountable. I'll give another example from our own work. HRA has profiled Judge Salavati at length. Our documentation of his violations includes a victim list of 61 individuals, 3 groups, a near 4,000-word overview of his violations, as well as 50 reports detailing his violations and several evidentiary documents. I mean, his profile, along with hundreds of others, is available as open source material on the Spreading Justice website. And in addition to the things that are available, there is countless additional confidential information that can be made available upon request. So that's a way that I think that civil society and governments can really, really be working together to work towards this accountability. But beyond talk of targeted sanctions and how there should be a shift, governments must continue to publicly condemn the violations occurring. Today, there can be no legitimate claim to ignorance. Documentation efforts have become incredibly sophisticated, and it's not only with our documentation at HRA, but it's across the Iranian human rights civil society. I would say that arguably the refusal to acknowledge the severity of crimes being committed can be seen as silent complicity, and such abhorrent crimes simply cannot go unpunished. Ignoring these violations or opting for policies that turn a blind eye in favor of advancing relations presents a universal danger. But at the same time, and I think that all of the panelists have touched on this quite a bit, we're at an uncertain time when we talk about engagement with Iran. And we have to work to address the challenges of the ever-increasing isolation. So while the commitment to condemn these violations remains important, this type of soft diplomacy is becoming more and more ineffective, and governments really need to look to alternative methods. I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Skylar. And thanks to the work that you do and HRA does to advance these efforts. So I'll turn it over to Mohammad. Mohammad Al Abdallah is the director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center and a Syrian human rights activist. He previously worked as a research assistant for Human Rights Watch in Beirut, where he covered Syria. Al Abdallah Mohammed is a former political prisoner, having been imprisoned in Syria on 2 separate occasions for his work defending human rights and lobbying for political reform. Mohammad, as a Syrian human rights advocate, you bring a more regional lens to this issue. Could you talk about the culture of impunity in the Middle East? How have widespread human rights violations become normalized in the region? And what changes would you like to see to U.S. policy in the Middle East with regards to human rights?
Thank you very much for Shabnam and for the human rights activists in Iran. Indeed, human rights violations are widespread in the region, the Middle East, North Africa. This is very unfortunate, but if you look at the foreign policy of the United States, which is a very instrumental, principle for those foreign policies in the region, you look at the Bush administration spreading democracy and freedoms after Iraq war and admitting publicly Condoleezza Rice in her speech at the American University of Cairo, saying we overlooked human rights violations and we supported authoritarian regimes in exchange of fixed stability in the region. But then that fixed stability resulted 15 out of the 19 who hit us here in 9/11 were from a nation we supported the most, Saudi Arabia. But then that shift to promote democracy ended with President Obama and his disengagement from Middle East, North Africa. That kind of led those countries at their own. like everybody design their own foreign policy and intervene in their neighbors' conflicts. With the Arab Spring starting from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, and Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, we got a very much a chaotic situation in the region that's tainted of disengagement of the United States about these issues, war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed in a couple of countries, Syria, Libya, to a certain level in Egypt and in Iraq. But then you get the Trump administration who kind of empowered their allies on that front and overlooked what happened in Egypt in the military coup and the executions and the death penalties for lots of the political prisoners and the killing of and slicing of a journalist in his country's embassy overseas and in Turkey, that the Jamal Khashoggi case in Saudi Arabia. So all these countries influence each other. So when you don't have a well-designed policy that's consistent related to human rights in the region, that will be interpreted as a green light. You do what you want, we don't care, nobody is looking. And being selective as well, and the selectivity of calling out a human rights violation, so the focus on Iran only in the region or focus on Syria only does actually fire back, because those countries will be pointing to what usually we call the whataboutism. What about Saudi Arabia? What about Emirates? What about Yemen? What about, you do not call out those other countries because they're your allies or because you have troops in those countries or you have certain financial and economic interests there. And this is true. The US foreign policy lacks reliability and credibility when there's selectivity in pointing out a human rights violation. So as Michael mentioned in his remarks, we need a human rights-based foreign policy to start with, and this needs to be regional. It does not ignore a country and focuses on another country. Another point I want to mention in this context is that the use of sanctions usually, especially in cases like Syria is under sanction, and we face similar challenges. Sanction is not a substitute of justice, and it's not a tool for justice. It is a tool for policy tool for behavioral change, for pressuring governments, and basically to be used in that political context. But we are in a case, and Iran very much like Syria here, although Iran is not in a conflict, thankfully, there's no civil war internally, that those governments are taking their nationals, their citizens, their people as hostages on their debate with the West and their fights with the international community. So we're going to keep you hostages here as a nation. We're going to suffer with us with the sanctions because of our actions as a government. We're not going to loosen up any of the political pressures, although we're facing together economic pressures because of the sanctions and because of the behavior of the government, and kind of bargain with the international community on the well-being and basically the resources for their own people. This is the case in Syria. This is the case in Iran. This was the case in Libya at a certain time. This was the case in Iraq during Saddam Hussein time. So this is a very difficult scenario where the government take the nation hostage and we don't have much alternatives. We don't have solutions. The ideas Christina mentioned of universal jurisdiction or empowering the UN through UN mechanisms or special procedures, all of them fall short from accomplishing much meaningful change. It's definitely much better than nothing. It's what we have and we have to work with it, but it's not a good solution for those cases. One final comment here. I want to go back to looking how the region would look if a human rights framework is in place where the US calls out their allies on human rights violations. So do they do it with their political adversaries, not only picking and choosing in those countries? That would empower the human rights community inside those countries, because when the US starts signaling one country and focus on it, that puts their own local human rights community at risk, because they will be internally accused of being associated with the West or being paid by the West or being spy to the West. And we've seen a lot of these charges against prominent human rights activists, although some of them have a clear track record of being anti-sanction or anti-US, but that doesn't help you. Even if, like, when we faced charges, when I was in prison in Syria, these comments came up in the court, not officially in the charges, but by the security agencies. Although we have a clear position on Iraq war, for example, I protested against Iraq war, but yet accused of being spy and agent by the US and pushed to do changes that the nation doesn't want to see in Syria. So without that framework, we're falling short from making much changes. One final comment is that most of the UN mechanisms, be it the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council, be it most of the UN conventions, all of them, one inherent characterizations of the working through the UN is that actually you need the cooperation of the member state. You cannot force a member state to work with you if they're not cooperative voluntarily, let's say. So having discussions with member states, even the difficult ones like the Iranian government, is something that diplomats should consider, like discussing with the Iranian government about their human rights violations. Sometimes there's some tactics and maneuvers. Some of those governments, they give you a lot if you have it in a closed door conversation because they don't want to be named and cited and shamed in public statements. But without a member state cooperation, you're not going to get much from processes like the UPR or the special procedures at the UN, because the special rapporteurs will be communicating with the Ministry of Justice in Iran. If they don't receive responses, then the whole process is stalled. I'll stop here. We can debate how those mechanisms could work more in favor of the Iranian people. But I want to cite as well that sanctions, agreed with Michael and with Patrick and with everybody in the panel that the way they design the sanctions, although there's exemptions that are clear, and they say, and this is one of the questions we got already, that the Iranian government saying the vaccination is not reaching people because of the sanctions. The general exemptions and the general license issued by OFAC usually very broad, and financial institutions or companies or businesses do not honor them much. They want a specific what's so-called letter of comfort. And this is what happened during the Obama administration. The Obama administration issued a letter of comfort to lots of financial institutions and encouraged them to do specific types of transactions with the Iranian government. So there are some tools the international community and governments could use in leveraging the relation with Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think it's quite difficult to work on Iran or Syria or many of the countries in the Middle East without feeling quite disillusioned with the international system and kind of the gaps that are there. And so I think this is a nice segue. Again, we've received quite a few questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. I will get through as many of them as possible, but please feel free to keep putting those questions in. So in this regard, when it comes to the accountability gap, I wanted to turn it over to Human Rights Watch, HRA, and SJAC, Mohammed, on this question of victim support. Because in the meantime, while there is no accountability mechanisms in place, one of the questions was in regards to the downing of flight PS 752 and the Association of Families and the lack of justice and maybe some of the frustrations that the West condemns the downing of the flight, but still negotiates or speaks with the Iranian government. So what can human rights organizations be doing to support victims and their families in the interim during this period of an accountability gap? I'll ask Michael first, and then HRA and SJAC if they have any comments.
It seems Patrick wants to speak about this as well. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, I'm very happy to start. I think from our perspective, it's a very important question. I would say the first step, other than I think on the case of the killing of almost 200 people and the shoot down of the airline, I think the first thing is that we as Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations need to show where and if there is any domestic accountability for what has happened. Have, for instance, senior Revolutionary Guard commanders been held responsible? Has there been a judicial process that is trying to hold people accountable that have carried out these actions that have killed and affected so many people? The answer is no, but I think that's kind of a first step. And I think, you know, in the past, you know, we've also tried to show how the Iranian government has harassed, targeted, intimidated, sometimes arrested and detained family members that are claiming, you know, pushing for justice domestically. So I think that's the one avenue where I think there's a role for human rights organizations. I think number two, it really is, you know, it's trying to support families that they should be the center, right? They should be the main voice in pressuring on ways forward. I would say there's a specific question here about how fast certain mechanisms can go. And in particular, the question, or one of the, how I see it, one of the questions is how fast the mechanism can go for the International Court of Justice ultimately to arbitrate and decide on this. And as I understand, and this is not where my expertise lies, the process is an incredibly slow one, particularly in terms of arbitration between member states, in this case, Canada and Iran, you know, discussing these issues, and that if either party feels like the arbitration mechanisms that comes through a technical UN body of ICAO, which is the Council of this International Civil Aviation Organization, if that doesn't, you know, then it can be appealed to the International Court of Justice. But it's a slow process. So I want to maybe defer to others about other panelists on other ideas and how they think, you know, that push can be done more quickly.
I can make a quick intervention here, is that the continuous speaking out of the families and the advocacy efforts the families are leading, and their association is really important and needs to continue and to be supported by the human rights community. So the demands of the families is really important. This is what's known as the victim-centered approach. So basically having the priority of the families and their demands and their best interest and well-being and the discussion between governments and the Iranian government. So part of that work the human rights organization can do is support the families in better framing their policy demands and recommendations with member states, help them brief them on positions of certain member states towards Iran and towards sanctions and toward the GCPOA, just to inform them and help them frame their demands. Also encouraging diplomats and meeting with them and encouraging them to meet with the families and to meet representatives with the families and to keep this topic alive in public. These all build up, and in Syria we've seen the same, although the situation in Syria is much worse, where families of missings, thousands of missing, unknown exact number of missings. But recently they started an initiative to start a mechanism for truth about detainees and missing, not accountability, which is, there's expectation Russia might support the mechanism because it's kind of a middle ground, not going to lead anybody to prison, but could help sort or solve the issue with the families. So such engagement, supporting their advocacy campaign, naming and shaming officials involved in the process, all will build up. Definitely, as Michael said, like, it's a very long battle. It's going to take time. It needs patience and time and commitment. But of course, nobody more committed to such causes more than the families and the relatives of the victims.
If I may speak up, I have been an expert witness in more than 30 federal court cases against Iran, seeking damages for its support for organizations engaged in terror attacks against Iranians. And that has led to U.S. court judgments for tens of billions of dollars against Iran. And that has led to the seizure of several $billion in assets, primarily from banks. And this has been one of the major reasons why international banks are extremely reluctant to engage in transactions with Iran, because they're concerned that they will be caught up in such litigation, and with good reason. And that what this litigation has done is created a group of lawyers who vigorously chase after any assets from Iran related in any way to the Iranian government would show up in the international financial system. So I'm not a fan of these laws, even though I've been, as I say, an expert witness and been cited by judges as reasons for billions of dollars in judgments against Iran. And these suits are continuing, so that there are now suits on behalf of more than 4,000 U.S. soldiers who were injured or killed in Iraq, who are claiming damage to the Iranian government. I suspect that will lead to many billions of dollars more in judgments. And these cases, these findings against Iran are going to be a major impediment for any kind of Iranian return to the international financial system for decades to come.
If I could just say one other thing as well, I think that this question really highlights the importance of civil society working together as well. I was just speaking with colleagues earlier this week on how, you know, our different databases and our different documentation efforts can really complement each other, while the project that we're talking about today really focuses on violators. This database also is connected directly with victims. So if you go on the database and you want to, you know, look at victims that are connected to various violators, you can find that. And that happens from a result of our, you know, our own research, but we also, you know, are working together with other civil society actors inside of Iran to make everything, you know, come together in a complementary way. So I just think it's an important point to touch on regarding documentation as well.
Thank you, everyone, for your response to that question and the importance of a victim-centered approach to justice and human rights advocacy efforts. Since there were a lot of, I think it's impossible to talk about diplomacy with Iran and US policy without talking about sanctions, and sanctions came up quite a bit. There were a couple questions related to sanctions. One is on the immunity Iran has built towards sanctions to some extent or another, building because of the length of time that sanctions have been in place. They've built a financial system and relationships to evade sanctions, and so how effective are they today? And then also, I think, you know, the issue with sanctions is, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you know, if you impose more sanctions, there's a risk that it could affect the ordinary people. If you lift sanctions, there's a risk you're empowering human rights abusers. So how can we ensure that the Iranian government is not exploiting the lifting of sanctions, specifically regarding technologies, and that there's not an unintended impact there?
I would consider carefully what's going to happen if we reduce the reliance on the sanctions tool. And that during the years in which the sanctions in Iraq were much decried by the human rights community, I frequently made myself unpopular by speaking on college campuses and warning that if we took away the sanctions, the effectiveness of the sanctions tool on Iraq, that was going to change the U.S. government debate and could well lead to a U.S. war in Iraq. And that's what happened. And so I would consider carefully that what's the alternative if we say to the U.S. government, don't use sanctions as much against Iran, in that it would concern me that that would affect the debate inside the U.S. government about the use of military force against Iran.
I can weigh in here a little bit because Syria has the same question, like how bad the sanctions are harming average citizens in Syria, average Syrian civilians. while in principle those sanctions were introduced and put in place to protect the civilians in Syria at the first place. And as you mentioned, Shabnam, this is kind of an impossible equation to solve. If you lift the sanctions, the bad governments will flourish, will get resources easily, will put those resources to use in bad place, unfortunately, not necessarily in a good place. But if you keep the sanctions or tighten them more, directly you're going to harm people you were planning and intending to protect at the first place. And to be honest, and this is inherent part of the Syria debate, like how much sanctions produced a change of policy or behavior in the past, whether be it Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Iraq, Libya, Iran, or Syria. Like in neither of these cases, we've seen real change of policy and behavior. Although these countries, of course, keep aside the sanctions as an excuse for their bad governance, failures, and failed states in some cases, but they do not tend to change their behavior easily in this situation. And it results in the hostage-taking scenario I mentioned before. Like, okay, we're sanctioned, we're going to take the entire country with us down. You're all going to starve because we're sanctioned because of our behavior, but we're not going to change it. And waiting for the international community to start seeing the suffering of the average civilians and they start pointing to it, and then as a reason to lift those sanctions. So it's very difficult policy question, not real much alternative. What we advise in the Syria case is to be as targeted as possible, to be narrow on the sanctions, do not target sectorial or departments directly, like the oil and gas industry, for example, because it provides gas and heating oil and cooking gas to everybody. It's very specific and brave in the exemptions as well, like be very broad in the exemptions and go the extra mile. And this has been a back and forth with Treasury a lot in Syria. Like every time we approach Treasury about exemptions, they say, oh, there's a general license 11 in Syria, it's still active, use it. But nobody honors this, not banks, not shipping companies, not financial institutions, not technology companies. And then you see the over-compliance process just happen because nobody want to deal with a ticket or penalty from OFAC, which is very heavy usually. It's not a joke. So the deterrence factor of the sanction is really causing more harm than what the sanctions are probably intended or planned to be. And this is where a thorough review of the sanctions and continuous review of them and the exemptions is needed always.
Thank you, Mohammed. Did anyone else want to respond to this issue? I know quite a few of you remarked on sanctions during your... Okay, great. So another question that has come up with regards to the international approach towards Iran is naming and shaming and condemning human rights abuses on the international level. And I think that there was a concern in one of the questions comments that has international condemnation been effective, or does it lead to further harms to political prisoners or others in Iran that are facing abuses? And what have been some of the positive and negative impacts of international condemnation? I can't remember which speaker spoke to this, but about the prisoners in Iran and the lessening of the death penalty specifically, leading to as a result of international advocacy and local advocacy, but the commenter was concerned that it's also led to further crackdowns on prisoners.
I'm happy to just jump in because I think it was me who at least raised the death penalty component. I mean, I'll take it as a counterfactual. I don't think it's been very successful when the U.S. or other countries have not said anything, right, about human rights violations. Like, it's incredibly clear on the kind of like soft approach, are like, oh, it's better. Usually the phrase is something along the lines of, it's better when we engage quietly with insert U.S. ally, Egypt, than it is to confront them publicly. Egypt has 60,000 political prisoners, right? Like even these kind of relationships that the U.S. has with allies that have committed very serious abuses, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Saudi Arabia domestically. Those are things where I don't think a quiet approach has been successful. I think the issue is that there is very limited leverage. That's what I was trying to frame it as. It's that most of this discussion is working in the margins in a literal sense, right? It is people Iranian officials who travel abroad. So there are actions to try to use universal jurisdiction, something that's not Iran's jurisdiction, to hold them accountable. It's having sanctions that are affecting people's bank accounts outside of the country, right, through Magnitsky sanctions, or freezing their access to certain country. So I want to be very open. There are incredible limits because of the nature of leverage that exists between the U.S. and Iran and the international community. So we're trying to think about ways to identify that we can put some pressure on and support victims who both domestically and abroad are facing the brunt of these abuses. What I tried to make a note on is that it's really a process over time, right? Is that if the international community, and what I mean is U.S. allies, UN mechanisms, are patient over a period of time, you can push for change. Drug laws are a good, imperfect example. The drug laws are still bad, right? There are still a possibility to be executed for drug offenses in Iran. However, the number of executions from, let's say, 2017 to 2018 greatly decreased because of some of these changes. They raised the bar, for using the death penalty against people charged with drug offenses. But that's a long, slow, and frustrating process that doesn't achieve the ultimate outcomes of some kind of creating a new government that respects, the full plethora of civil, political, and socioeconomic rights. But I don't think the opposite, not saying anything, is useful at all. I think we're full of counterfactuals where that has been an unsuccessful policy as well.
I can use an example quickly here to respond to the question as well and support Michael's point as well. When Canada spoke about women's rights and violations that committed by Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government sanctioned Canada directly. They cut oil trade with Canada. They pulled 100,000 students, Saudi students funded by the government who study in Canada, pulled them immediately out of colleges and universities and started basically cutting ties. And the rest of the world was watching. EU didn't say a word. The US didn't say a word. And Canada was left alone facing Saudi Arabia. I know that the balance is kind of tilted clearly here. Canada is our neighbor, our ally, one of the advanced Western liberal countries, but they were left alone fighting, and something very principled for all these countries, and they witnessed what's happening and they just kept silent. But to the other point as well, yes, naming and shaming and big campaigns worked, and it worked in a couple of places. In 2008, Saeed Murtadawi used to be the prosecutor of Tehran, was planning to show up in New York and deliver a speech at the General Assembly, if I remember well, and there was a big campaign calling for arresting him if he comes to the United States, although the US doesn't have the legal jurisdictions or the ground to take him to custody or to prosecute him here. After the campaign was really public, he got scared and he dropped his trip to the UN at his own. So he did not show up here. Yes, those campaigns work from time to time. You can deter somebody from participating. You can pressure in specific cases. As Michael mentioned, it's going to take really, really long time and concerted efforts to move the needle a little bit, especially with those closed regimes who does not have multilateral relations. We have a joke in the Middle East, especially in Syria, where the Syrian government kind of tainted the regimes around them. So the ones who work with the international community and the West, they're just puppets for the West. They're spies for the West. That's Mubarak regime in Egypt, Ali Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia, and Ali Saleh in Yemen. But that worked well, actually, during the Arab Spring, because those governments who had leverage with the West and have multilateral relations with the West managed to practice their leverage and kind of slowed the bloodbath in those places, whether Egypt or Tunisia to a certain level in Yemen, versus the countries, if you look at them, who were anti-West and anti-multilateralism, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and even Syria today with Assad, is the countries where only military force basically worked and somehow to protect civilians, and it didn't end up protecting them. And we got the three scenarios: a full intervention in Iraq, semi-intervention in Libya, and no intervention in Syria. And the result is almost the same: failed state, disasters, humanitarian crisis, and the country in a bloodbath. So yes, that's the only thing we can do with advocacy efforts, and we should not give up on them. It worked, and one of the questions was in Farsi. I translated it that if that ever helped in Syria, it helped in some cases. It's not Switzerland, Syria. Like when you ask them about violation and they solve it next morning, it's not like this. But the alternative is just letting the government do all the violations and not care about them, and we cannot afford to do that.
It's important to note that yesterday when we had our preliminary conversation, there are problems and issues with each one of these mechanisms. There are pluses and minuses, but what's really important is that there are very few mechanisms available. So at the risk of there being some potential small negative consequences, we have to maximize what few tools we have available to us and use them. And that's one. And it's important. I think what the human rights community needs to be doing going forward is just be a little more strategic and a little better coordinated among the different groups and the different interests here, so that it isn't one-offism where one UJ case, one negotiation, one sanction, one criminal prosecution, but perhaps just a more concerted effort to bring together all of the efforts, focus on each issues, and drive impact that we can't get from the mechanism itself, but we can get by the way we approach the variety of mechanisms available to us.
Thank you for that point, Christina. There's just, I know we're almost out of time, but I think there's one important question that came up from Sirwan Mansouri that I wanted to turn over to Skylar to talk about in terms of HRA's documentation of ethnic and religious minorities and any specific challenges related there and experiences working with the Kurdish community specifically in Iran.
Yeah, thank you, Shabnam. That's an excellent question. I think, you know, in terms of documentation in any regard, especially in terms of Iran, there are so many challenges, and one of the biggest challenges is access. The other one is obviously making sure that there are security concerns in place. You know, we face these, and I will be completely transparent. I can't speak to the question exactly on, you know, access to Kurdish communities. I know that this is an entire section of our database. We are, you know, if you want to look at violators that are perpetrating against the Kurdish minorities specifically, you can find that. And so we've really made this a priority in our research and our documentation efforts as well. But I'll speak to the challenge of security and access. Something that I think is a strength of HRA is our access inside of Iran. We have such a wide network of volunteers that are documenting and researching, and they are trained, they train each other. And so this is, you know, a strength. We have that access, and it's sort of part of what I touched on in my remarks, that this is the access that government should really be taking advantage of because it is unparalleled. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think, yeah, that's what I can offer for that.
Thank you, Skylar. And unfortunately, we're out of time. And this was, I know that we didn't come to any, you know, grand conclusions or solutions to these issues, but I think, you know, panel touched really well on some of the biggest concerns and challenges And I think, organizations like the ones present, Human Rights Watch, HRA, and others are, doing the important work of documentation, highlighting these violations. And I think if there were any questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, my apologies. And I've heard from HRA that they will answer the rest of the questions through Twitter. So keep an eye on their Twitter account. Maybe you can put the handle in the chat or the Q&A so people can see what that handle is. Skylar, would you like to close us out? Any final remarks from your end?
I don't have anything prepared, but I'd like to really thank everyone for coming today. Big thank you to the panelists for making the time. And as Shabnam said, we'll make sure to answer the questions in the coming hours. So please follow us on Twitter if you have not already. And yeah, thank you. Please reach out if you want to continue the discussion at all. We're always available.